if there is some risk related to CO2 emissions and greenhouse effect and all that stuff, why not just at this moment just start a massive transition to green?
Well, so we can talk about green, but you might make it would be a stronger argument if it were alternatives, and then we can talk about why the Greens are anti-nuclear and anti-hydro, which are the only decent non-CO2.
Right. Okay. So let's do that then. So they'd hear what you said. Said, okay, I buy all of that.
Right.
That being said, if it's still putting out some bad stuff into the atmosphere and we're not sure exactly what that's going to do, and even if we cut our emissions in the United States, that India and China are still going through what we went through 50 years ago, and they're going to keep putting this stuff out, why not just make that transition anyway?
So there's a couple of issues here, but one is thinking in the full context means being really clear about magnitude. So one is, what is the magnitude of superiority of what the fossil fuel industry is doing versus the others? And then what is the magnitude of the downsides? So let's say hypothetically, so Al Gore gave this speech in 2008. Al Gore, my favorite person.
You're your buddy. We'll get to Al Gore.
My buddy. But he said we should outlaw by the year 2018 all what he calls non-renewable sources of power. So basically he wanted solar, wind, and some geothermal. And he claimed we could do this, and he claimed, I know of renewable sources that can generate energy for the equivalent of less than $1 a gallon of gasoline. Now, I've asked what this is. He still has not named this source, but he was willing to outlaw all of American energy in order to do it. So, and at the same time, he would claim that we're decades away from 20-foot sea level rises, which would be a very, very negative thing, very, very hard to adjust to. So that's kind of one scenario of magnitudes where fossil fuel industry actually has no magnitude of superiority in terms of generating energy, and it has an incredible damage, an incredible downside. But what if it was true that, say, we had a minor amount of warming and that the fossil fuel industry was just was generations ahead of everyone else? In terms of a transition, I think the implication would be, and I think this is the implication no matter what, is that you would want a free market transition. So you'd want to look at what are other technologies and are there any things we can do to liberate them? And I think the number one thing you could observe is that the environmentalists since the 70s have made nuclear power drastically more expensive, many times more expensive. So instead of the cost going down over time, which is the natural progression as human ingenuity is applied, the cost has gone up many-fold, even though nuclear is provably the safest form of power ever devised.
Yeah, wait, let's pause there for a sec. So they made the cost go up because they forced what you would, I think, argue are unnecessary regulations.
Yeah, so essentially, with everything in life, you have to have a certain threshold. So basically, their threshold of safety is what they would call infinite. So let's say nuclear is 100 times safer than any form of power. I don't know the exact numbers, but that's not implausible, right? They'll say basically, no, it has to be 1,000,000 times safer. And so, at a certain point, you can make anything infinitely expensive by having an unlimited number of employees, an unlimited amount of containment, or an unlimited amount of time, which is perhaps the most damaging thing. So you have a nuclear reactor. You used to be able to build these things in a couple of years. Now you can basically not build them. Your chances of building them are certainly less than 1/2, and it takes over 20 years. So that's
because in effect because of the regulations that they've helped push through governments, they've forced the price to go up because you need more people, you need more research, you need more
capital.
More capital.
Yeah, I mean, if you just think about if somebody says, "Hey, Dave, I need some money. Like you just came into all this money through Patreon. You're really successful now. Like help us finance."
I'm not building a nuclear
plant. We've got a new
plant,
and it at minimum it's going to be ready in 20 years, but it may never be approved. What are you going to do? Are you going to do that? I mean, there's no way you want to touch that. And then what happens is, because of that, they have to get subsidies and special loans, and then the Greens say, "See, look, you can't compete on the free market," but it's like, bashing in it's like the Tanya Harding approach, right? It's like Nancy Kerrigan. See, Nancy Kerrigan, you can't compete on the free skating market. No, but you're not allowed to bash the person's leg. So my point is that a real alternative energy policy is just a free market. So that's what you get. And you had much more of that in the 70s than you do today. So I think it's very revealing that they're not for that. But my own evaluation of the negatives of fossil fuels, particularly with CO2, is that they're much, much less than people think. And therefore, I think it's a good thing that we're continuing to expand it. And I think it would be very good if we could continue to expand other things, but whatever is competitive on the free market. We shouldn't force people to use junk because that just increases the price. But I think there's a lot of different exciting things, but I think they're generally the opposite of green energy, which you raised before. And so there's a question of why are the Greens obsessed with what I call the unreliables, with solar and wind that can't reliably produce electricity? Why is that their number one focus instead of nuclear and hydro? I think anyone who's sympathetic to them needs to ask that and really ask, is the issue CO2 or is it something else?
Right. So on the nuclear front, would you say the threshold, like, so for example, what happened in Japan about 4 years ago now, and they've been saying that this reactor has been leaking into the Pacific, and you know, you hear people say, well, now this stuff is eventually going to make its way over to the west coast of the United States, and radiation and all that stuff. Would you say that well, first off, do you agree that that is true?
Well, this is all a threshold issue. So there's this idea that no amount of radiation is safe, but we're experiencing radiation right now. I'm getting some from the potassium inside your body right now, right?
Yeah.
If you go to Colorado, you'll get more radiation. I mean, I don't know how off-color people can be, but the best the best nuclear line ever from Edward Teller, Edward Teller is this brilliant physicist who helped invent the H-bomb, and I don't think never got a Nobel Prize because he was extremely anti-communist. But he was trying to explain to people that you shouldn't be afraid of a nuclear power plant. He basically said if you live right next to a nuclear power plant, you get slightly more radiation than you do by sleeping next to your wife. And he said, what's the lesson from this? Well, sleeping with one woman is safe, but sleeping with more than one is very, very dangerous. So,
yeah.
But that's what, like, people have no concept that it's all about the threshold. So the idea is, the question would be, is there anything resembling a dangerous threshold? And you don't have any deaths at all. You don't have radiation sickness. What you do have is scares where people do die because of forced evacuation. So this happened in 3 Mile Island as well. Nobody died. There was no threat of death from radiation, but you have these elderly populations. You have them scared, and it's because there's this demonization. And I think there's a big parallel between the demonization of man-made CO2 and the demonization of man-made radiation. And what I would argue is that the anti-human movement demonizes everything man-made, and we expect it to be bad even before we investigate that it's bad. So we expect any change of climate to be bad before we truly investigate it.
Okay, so the anti-human movement, I like that phrase in general. It just it's got very dystopian something there. I like it. So basically, it seems to me that there's an element to these types of people that think that everything's about us, sort of, that I think you maybe don't think.
Can you elaborate on that?
That they think that there's something sort of empowering in a way. If you think that we are controlling, that through our actions, we're controlling the environment, in a way, it's it's really focused on you. You know what I mean? That I live in West Hollywood where we don't have plastic bags anymore. And at Trader Joe's, if I have to pay 10 cents for a paper bag, which I usually do, but they prefer that you bring your own bag. And I always think, like, it's nice that we're doing this, and I try to bring my bag when I can. But, like, I always think it's more like we're just sort of doing this to sort of feel good about ourselves, really, because no matter what we do here, especially on that very local level, as I said before, China and India are going through their industrial revolution now. They're going to, no matter what we do that makes us feel good here, they're going to keep doing all of that stuff. So in some ways, it's sort of just, it's like a combination of sort of lack of science and keeping things about yourself. Did I get anywhere on there?
It's interesting because this is often the conservative criticism, which I think is generally wrong. So I think it's much more that, I think it's much more a hell narrative. I think if you look at the idea of a hell and what causes you to go to hell, I think that's much more of a parallel. Because if you think of like what causes you to go to hell, you violate a certain commandment. And the commandment it's not necessarily a scientific thing. It's just that this is what was commanded. And if you go against it, then there's going to be a negative consequence.
So this is like gays cause earthquakes kind of thing.
Sure.
That kind of, which you don't buy into.
No, I don't even know that I've ever heard it.
Well, Pat Robertson will get, every time there's an earthquake, Pat Robertson will say, these gays are having sex.
It's all fracking. So
okay, now he's into fracking instead of the gays, Gay is out.
Fracking,
now it's
there's a hypothetically plausible causal relation.
Can you imagine a gay fracking? Then he'd really...
I can, actually.
That would be something.
I can.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're going to this idea. What's the idea? That it's somehow a view of it's all about us. But so let's look at it from a different direction. If you look at industrialization is all about us. in the sense of we are taking a planet, and what we're saying about the planet is this planet is imperfect. It's not nearly safe enough in its natural state, and it doesn't have nearly as much stuff that we can use, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to transform the heck out of it by using our minds to create these machines and then create energy that can feed these machines and make ourselves hundreds of times more powerful. And the planet is going to look completely different because of what we do. So I call this human progress, and I think this is fantastic. But if you look at the Greens or the anti-humans, they don't think this is fantastic. They don't think, oh, it's all about us. Isn't this so great? What they're always worried about is the ecology or the ecosystem or Gaia, you know, having some revenge on us. But the focus is not really our power. It's actually our stupidity. It's our hubris. They think, oh, you think you can just change everything and be okay. You think that you can split the atom and play God and it's going to be fine. But it's not. You're going to get punished. And that's why they always have this divine retribution, except it's not divine. It's the ecology. But no matter what happens, every decade they have a new form in which the ecosystem is going to exact retribution for our industrial sins. It always changes. So there's no change in the dynamic. There's just a change in the specific as each dynamic gets refuted.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So basically, I think that they would generally argue that someone like you is anti-science, because they would say, oh, okay, all these climate scientists say this, he's saying the reverse. But what you're saying is actually they're anti-science because, yeah, we split the atom, and then they go, but some bad shit's gonna happen because of it. But you would say, well, that's what human progress is. And
right.
yeah, some shit's gonna happen. And we'll have to figure, and we'll figure that out, right? I mean, so that really is the most scientific.
Yeah, so I'd say, I mean, fundamentally, to put it in Ayn Rand terms, I think they're anti-mind. So one way of looking at this is I mentioned that there's this idea that man-made CO2 is bad, man-made radiation is bad, but man-made industrialization is bad. So basically, everything man-made is considered bad. So, now at this moment in time, plastic bags are considered less natural than paper. If you go into Whole Foods, right, it's all about natural, local.
Right.
As little technology went into this product as possible, right? That's what green ultimately boils down to.
Right.
So the ideal, think about what is the ideal green earth, the ideal green anything, is what the world would look like if human beings had never existed. That is their ideal, right? What's the ideal form of food? The kind of food that would exist if human beings had never existed. Right. What's the ideal amount of CO2 in the atmosphere? The amount of CO2 that would exist if human beings had never existed. What's the amount of radiation if human beings had never existed? So they have this very deep premise. So what is the man-made? The man-made is simply the form of change in nature that exists created by a human mind. That's the only difference, right? Change is inherent in nature. That's why climate change is this kind of inane term, right? But everything changes things. Everything is transforming things in nature. But the man-made, the only difference is that it's driven by a mind. So if you're anti-man-made, you're anti-mind-made, and you're anti-mind. So then you might ask, why do they appeal to science all the time? Why do they try to take the high ground on science? And the answer is because science has a lot of prestige, and if you want to put over bad ideas, invoke science. But notice they're against all the practical products of science, at least the core leaders of the movement.
Right. They're using them all the time, though.
What do you mean?
Well, they're using all the things that science has given us.
Right. Well, the way I think of it is this, like, would the Green Movement, if it could go back in time, would the Green Movement have approved turning a patch of dirt and trees into New York City? Would they? Would Greenpeace have a thumbs up to New York City?
I guess at best it would have been a lot slower.
No
right?
chance. No chance.
Right. So Central Park would be a lot bigger.
So basically their philosophy would have prevented everything that we know from existing. But they are parasites on that. And then they, so they're hypocrites. But this is the way that all bad ideas work, is basically the people promoting the bad ideas want people to contradict them to a certain amount, because if you followed all the bad ideas, everyone would die. So what they want is people to contradict them so they can feed off of them. I mean, this is right out of Atlas Shrugged, but then they can keep them guilty. So what they want for the industrialists, like if you look at the oil companies or any companies, what they want is for the oil companies, they don't want the oil companies not to work. They want the oil companies to work and be super guilty and give them money and tell them that they're great for being what? for being nothing, for accomplishing nothing, for producing nothing. So it's basically people with a very deep resentment of productive human beings who want to feel important. And environmentalism or anti-humanism gave them this perfect vehicle. But if we call it anti-humanism, they're going to be a lot less confident and there will be fewer of them.
Yeah, it's funny because as you're saying that, it makes me think of what I've been saying lately about just pundits on television. They've never made anything. They've never done anything that's created anything, but they somehow know how to do everything all the time. You know what I mean? They always know that, oh, if we save $200 billion to do this, if with this tax cut and blah, blah, blah. And it's like, well, you've never done anything. You just keep saying things, but you've never actually created. It's a lot easier to do that than actually create, right?
And I think psychologically, I haven't studied this, but this is plausible to me. I've heard different studies that there's just a deep inferiority complex among intellectuals who just don't really feel productive in a certain way. Now, I don't experience this myself. I mean, I think it's useful to learn how to do certain kinds of physical things, but I also am an intellectual who worships the physical creators. So I give them justice, and I know, who's buttering my bread, so to speak. Right? I mean, I know when I talk to somebody from industry that they are making possible my way of life. And for instance, the universities are the opposite, because modern universities, I mean, we have way too many people going to college, I think, but however many people we would like to go to college is way more than the number that would go to college if we were non-industrialized. And yet the universities have incredible contempt for industry. And I think it's just a very disturbing thing that you have all these talking heads, all these mindless students often, and they have no appreciation. So let's say even the fossil fuel companies were screwing up way more than I think. I mean, I don't even put it that way. I think they're doing a great job in general. But you should still have a lot of appreciation for what they're accomplishing. And you should still realize that you're paying them to do that.
Right.
So we have this idea where the non-producers can demand this impossible perfection of the producers and look down on them even though you're doing nothing, which is like the Teddy Roosevelt, the Teddy Roosevelt quote about the man in the arena. Like Teddy Roosevelt's really into sports and stuff, so he talks about how the man in the arena is the one who's admirable, even though everyone outside, he said it's not the critic who counts.
Yes,
and
right,
that's
right.
important.
Right, so when you're watching a basketball game and they always know the guy
it's just like, oh,
the
LeBron,
play-by-play guy always.
Like, what's going on with LeBron? I mean, come on, I can't play basketball.
He's human. I think that has something to do with it. Okay, so all that said, when something like the Exxon Valdez happens or the BP oil spill in the Gulf, and when these things happen, now, I get it. Nothing's a perfect system, so these things are going to happen. But for someone like you, when you see the BP oil spill and you see all of the birds and the otters and all this stuff covered in all this oil, and know that I just remember those days where they had online, you could just watch that burst pipe just spewing all this stuff into the ocean. How do you feel about that?
Well, it's a negative, but there's always this issue of magnitude. And I always look, particularly if I know that we have a tendency to be biased against one industry, I'm always suspicious of these, like, why is the oil spill considered the worst thing in the world? So to me, 11 people died on that. That was the tragedy of it. I mean, the thing exploded.
Right, so the guys on the rig.
11 people are extinguished, right?
Yeah.
I mean, they never get to do anything. Again, and their families, lives are just, that's the thing. If you look at oil is, to use a green term, like an organic substance. I mean, it's just ancient kind of life, and lots of things in the ocean like it, and then certain kinds of animals don't like it. So, and of course, they'll only point to the bird, so if it's on a bird, it'll choke the bird, and that's not something that I relish. But in terms of the things that happen to human beings, an oil spill is pretty low on the list. So what I think it shows is this idea, again, of the man-made. If we accidentally put oil somewhere, it's bad. But there are 2 Exxon Valdez's coming out of the Gulf of Mexico naturally all the time in the form of oil seeps. So if you look at the tar sands, that's just one giant oil spill by nature in Canada. So I think we always have to watch out for this bias against the man-made, the bias against the human. I think the sort of better examples are, with solar and wind, there's an example I talk about in the book where when you're mining for those elements, for the kinds of metals that you use in solar panels and particularly windmills, people die a lot because they happen in places like China, and they're in very dangerous situations because you're dealing with legitimately threatening amounts of radioactivity, and nobody cares about that. So I always look at what are the actual threats and non-threats of every form of energy, and what I try to do in, I think, chapter 2 of the book is go through them in a pretty fair way. Because it's not like I started out being pro fossil fuels. It's something that I came to. I mean, as a kid, I thought some like solar, and then I was never anti-nuclear really, although Simpson scared me a little bit. But I just kind of always figured, oh, well, solar is the greatest thing. But then once I looked at the equation, I thought, well, it's not nearly, and why are the enviros so focused on this when they could be focused on nuclear? But I mean, so I think the kind of most, the things that are more of a concern are like you say smog in China, right? Because to me, that's something where that's clearly a very unpleasant and in some cases unhealthy thing.
Right. So
for me,
it's
that's
literally affecting someone's life on that day-to-day basis.
Right. So
gets out of their
to me,
house.
that's much more of a concern than an oil spill.
So then what, in a case like that you're acknowledging that it's a legitimate concern,
Right.
What do you do? I guess you now find industry that cleans it up, right? I mean, that's the next
it
level.
depends on the
that needs
context.
to be
So
unlocked.
I like to look back in time and just think. I like to look at the 1800s as just sort of a reference point, because if you look at that time, they had much worse smog than China does today. I mean, much worse. And so the question is, did they have a green movement that said this is ruining everything, like we hate it? No, they had. There's a letter that I mentioned which says basically they're worried about running out of coal because they don't really understand the geology of it and how much of it there is, and they say, basically this would be like losing a limb. It would be that bad. And again, this is something that has all this smoke. And so from our perspective, we think, oh, this is so bad, it's so dirty. But why do they value it so much? Why don't they even focus on that? Because the value of energy to empower them, to improve their lives, to actually be fed, to actually be warm, that takes precedence over everything else. And so then the point is that whenever you're defining a threshold of pollution that you need to legislate regarding, you need to have the context of what's overall beneficial for human life and what your alternatives are. Now, fortunately today, we don't have to accept that threshold of smog and smoke, right? Because we have all sorts of alternatives and we have technology. So I think in the case of China, it's a midway case where they could, because it's a dictatorship, because they don't respect individual rights in many ways, what they did is they built a lot of coal plants, but it's not primarily coal plants, it's actually other things that use coal. They're just burning it in a very open way. But they did this very haphazardly because they had this national goal of industrialization without focusing on the purpose of industrialization, which is human flourishing. So I think if China and India had much better governments that focus on individual rights, they would have much less. But that's not to say they would have the same standards that we do, because they don't have the same level of wealth that we do. So it's contextual based on the state of economic and technological development. And one great philosopher friend of mine, while I was writing the book, he gave me this great analogy about, you could say the same thing about human health. So there's a point that I think is really important, that people are afraid of coal plants. You know what I'm afraid of? You. I'm afraid of humans, because humans are way dirtier than our machines, which again shows that we're against man-made things because we're afraid of machine waste, but not human waste. But human waste, and particularly the air we breathe out, is biological, and biological is much more dangerous than non-biological. So if I get sick, it's going to be from someone in this room, and that's how you're going to get sick and die most likely. Yeah. So why do we allow ourselves this kind of pollution, right? Well, because at the moment, it's not technologically preventable in any economic way, but it's much more dangerous than what the coal plants are doing. I haven't seen anything to contradict that. But in the future, let's say, he said, well, what if you had buildings where you had affordable technology that could filter all these diseases? Then you might say, you're required to do this, right? Or you're required to disclose if your building doesn't have this. So what is considered a dangerous thing in the future could be considered a normal thing in the present.